Imagine marching into the unknown, into enemy lines so lethal that every step could be your last. And then, vanishing. Not missing in the usual way, not captured, but disappearing so completely that the world could barely believe it happened. This is the story of the Lost Battalion of World War I. Or is it? Did they truly vanish into thin air? Or is there something more sinister behind their disappearance? The year was 1918, the location, the dense shell-pocked forests of the Argonne in France. American forces were pushing the German front lines in what would become one of the bloodiest campaigns in U.S. military history. Among them was a unit that would become infamous. The Solar Ottermanns Arbeiterbets Battalion. Around 550 men, mostly from the 77th Division, commanded by Major Charles Whittlesey, marched forward into a hellish maze of trenches, artillery, and machine gun fire. But what happened next has sparked debate for over a century. The battalion advanced. The plan seemed simple: break through the German lines, secure the forest, and hold the ground. But communication lines were primitive, artillery support was delayed, and the terrain, unforgiving. Within hours the battalion was surrounded, cut off from reinforcements, cut off from retreat, and trapped. By now some historians have described it as a nightmare scenario, a perfect storm of miscommunication, bad luck, and relentless enemy pressure. But eyewitness accounts hinted something far stranger. Reports from the front lines claim that for several harrowing days, the battalion was completely cut off from all support, surrounded by dense forest and enemy forces. The men were isolated, with no way to communicate with their allies or receive much-needed reinforcements. The silence of the woods was broken only by distant gunfire and the occasional desperate shout as the soldiers clung to hope in the face of overwhelming odds. German forces launched repeated attacks, determined to break through the Allied lines and crush the isolated battalion. Yet, against all expectations, the men held their ground, repelling wave after wave of assaults. Their resilience became the stuff of legend, as they refused to surrender, even when the situation seemed hopeless. As the days dragged on, supplies dwindled to almost nothing. The men were forced to ration every crumb of food and every drop of water. Many were wounded, their bandages stained and dirty. And exhaustion was etched into every face. Hunger gnawed at their strength, and the cold, damp trenches offered little comfort. And yet, despite the dire circumstances, nobody outside the forest knew for certain what was happening to them. Rumors spread among the other units, but the fate of the battalion remained a mystery, shrouded in the fog of war. In a moment of desperate courage, Major Whittlesey, the battalion's commander, managed to send a note through enemy lines. It was a daring, almost impossible act, risking everything to let the outside world know they were still holding on. In that hastily scribbled message, he reportedly wrote words that would echo through history. "We are surrounded, many are wounded, no reinforcements. The situation is critical, and our supplies are nearly gone. Still, we hold on as best we can, refusing to give up hope, even as the odds grow longer with each passing hour." That message was more than just a report. It was a plea for help, a warning to command, and in many ways, a puzzle that would haunt historians for years to come. Because after the guns fell silent and the war ended, stories began to emerge, stories from survivors and witnesses that didn't quite match the official record, leaving behind questions that remain unanswered to this day. Here's where it gets strange. In the chaos and confusion of those 3 harrowing days, something happened that no one could quite explain. Some survivors later claimed that, as the fighting raged and the fog thickened, parts of the battalion seemed to simply vanish into thin air. It wasn't just the usual chaos of war. There was something different, something unsettling in the air. Men who had been right beside their comrades would suddenly be gone, as if swallowed by the mist itself. Soldiers would go out on patrol, sometimes in pairs or small groups, and not return. Their tracks would lead into the dense woods, but then just stop. No sign of a struggle, no evidence of enemy action, just silence, and the ever-present fog. The men left behind could only wonder what had happened, their imaginations running wild as the hours dragged on. Even stranger, some of those who disappeared would reappear later, sometimes hours, sometimes a full day later, stumbling out of the mist, exhausted and confused. They spoke of wandering through ghostly landscapes deep in the Argonne, places that felt both familiar and utterly alien. The trees seemed to move, the ground felt unstable, and the air was thick with a sense of dread. These men described seeing things that defied explanation, shadows that darted between the trees, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. One private described a moment when the trees themselves appeared to shift and sway, as if alive, the fog closing in around him like it had a mind of its own. He said it felt as though the forest was trying to swallow him whole, and that every step he took only led him deeper into the unknown. Another soldier swore he had seen men who weren't there, shadowy figures moving just out of sight, always vanishing when approached. He described reaching out to one, only for it to dissolve into the mist before his eyes. These weren't just fleeting glimpses, they were vivid, haunting encounters that left the men shaken to their core. Now, skeptics will tell you, war is terrifying, hallucinations are common, and the stress of battle can fracture even the strongest mind. And that's true. The mind can play tricks, especially when pushed to its limits by fear, exhaustion, and trauma. But these stories weren't isolated incidents. They were shared by dozens of men, many of whom had never spoken to each other before. When so many soldiers report eerily similar experiences, strange disappearances, ghostly visions, and a sense that the forest itself was alive, it becomes harder to dismiss their accounts as mere imagination. Around campfires and in hushed whispers, these men shared their stories, each one echoing the last, each one adding to the growing sense of unease. And so, the line between history and legend begins to blur. What really happened in those fog-shrouded woods? Were these just the tricks of frightened minds, or did something truly inexplicable occur? Sometimes, the past refuses to give up all its secrets, and the story of the Lost Battalion remains one of its most haunting mysteries. When we look at the official records, the story of the Lost Battalion seems almost simple. The reports say that after 6 harrowing days trapped behind enemy lines, the battalion was finally rescued. The narrative is clear, the men endured, they held their ground, and when help arrived, most of them were still alive. It's a tale of perseverance, courage, and survival against the odds, a story that's been retold in history books and classrooms for generations. Major Whittlesey, their commander, was celebrated as a national hero. He and his men were awarded medals for their bravery. Newspapers across the country ran triumphant headlines, painting the battalion as symbols of American resilience. Their ordeal became a rallying point for the war effort, and their names were etched into the public memory as examples of what it meant to be a hero. But if you dig deeper, past the official reports and the headlines, you'll find a different story, one that's rarely told. Unofficial accounts, hidden away in personal letters that never made it into the archives, and diaries that only surfaced decades later, reveal a much darker reality. These first-hand testimonies, written in shaky handwriting and stained with mud, paint a picture that's far more unsettling. According to some of these men, their time in the forest wasn't just a desperate fight for survival. They wrote about a growing sense of dread, about feeling watched from the shadows. Some claimed that during those long, sleepless nights, they weren't just cut off from their allies, they were being stalked by something they couldn't explain. The enemy, they said, didn't seem entirely human. There were whispers of figures moving silently through the mist, of eyes glinting in the darkness, and of shapes that vanished whenever anyone tried to get a closer look. The men described a terror that went beyond the fear of bullets or bombs, a sense that something ancient and unknowable was hunting them. And then, there's the most chilling detail of all. When the battalion was finally rescued, not all the men were accounted for. Some bodies were never recovered, despite extensive searches. Their names were listed as missing, but there was no trace, no grave, no remains, nothing to mark where they had fallen. These men weren't just lost in the chaos of battle, or misidentified among the dead. They were simply gone, vanished without a trace, as if they had been erased from the earth itself. Their families never received closure, and their comrades were left with questions that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. It's as if the forest itself had swallowed them whole, leaving behind only silence and mystery, a secret that lingers in the shadows of history, waiting to be uncovered. Could it really be that entire pockets of soldiers disappeared without a trace? Military experts say no. They argue that chaos and misreporting in wartime easily explain missing men, but others aren't so sure. Some researchers point out inconsistencies in German records. Troop movements that don't match survivor reports. Areas that were supposedly clear, yet men claim to have been attacked there. It raises an uncomfortable question. Could something unrecorded, deliberate or accidental have occurred? Something that official history didn't want us to know. There are rumors, persistent, unverified, that elements of the battalion were captured by clandestine enemy units, experimented on, or even disarmed and led into traps designed to erase them entirely from the historical record. There's no solid evidence to prove these claims, and yet, when you read the journals, the letters, the memoirs, a pattern emerges. It's as if the battalion wasn't just lost on a map, it was lost in time. After the rescue, the narrative was, well, tidy. Whittlesey was celebrated, survivors returned to normal life, or, at least tried to, but some men were haunted. They never spoke of what happened in the woods of Argonne. Letters were cryptic, diaries ended abruptly. Psychologists today suggest what they experienced could have been extreme trauma, yet there's another, far darker interpretation, that something extraordinary, something the world just wasn't ready to acknowledge, really did occur. And here's the most provocative question. If elements of the Lost Battalion truly disappeared, why was the story quickly sanitized? Why were inconvenient accounts ignored? Was it the fog of war, embarrassment, or something else entirely, something that historians still hesitate to examine? We may never know the full truth, but the story leaves a haunting impression. The idea that in the midst of history's bloodiest conflicts, entire groups of men could vanish, leaving only fragments of their reality behind. So, did the Lost Battalion really disappear without a trace, or did the world simply choose not to see the full horror of what happened? Maybe the answer lies somewhere between documented history and whispered legend, between fact and the shadows of memory. One thing is certain, when you walk through the Argonne today among the trees and the mist, you might still feel it, that unsettling notion that history sometimes keeps secrets, that not every story ends where we think it does. The Lost Battalion lost or erased, you decide.